The garrison at Thresh Crossing was nobody's first posting and nobody's second. It sat at the northern lip of the Kaelsand mountain pass like a bruise on the rock. 43 soldiers, 1 cook, 1 armorer, 1 supply ledger that had not been updated since the previous commandant died of a chest infection 3 winters back. The pass itself was used by traders, by pilgrims, moving between the lowland city-states and the high plateau kingdoms, and by the occasional diplomatic party traveling under flags that the garrison was legally obligated to inspect, but practically unable to detain. We were there mostly to log who passed through and to look discouraging. I was assigned to Thresh Crossing because I had argued with my commanding officer. Not a shouting argument, I was never the shouting kind. I had simply said, in front of 12 other soldiers in a pre-mission briefing, that the plan as described was going to get people killed unnecessarily, and that there was a simpler approach if anyone wanted to hear it. The commanding officer did not want to hear it. The plan went forward. 3 soldiers took wounds that didn't need to happen. The commanding officer cited me for insubordination, and 4 weeks later I was at Thresh Crossing with a transfer order and a kit bag that smelled of mildew. My name is Bren Halvar. I was 36 years old when I arrived at that garrison. I had 11 years of service on my record, 2 commendations, 1 letter of censure, and the particular reputation that follows, a man who is known to say what he actually thinks. It is not a reputation that advances careers. It is, I have found, the only reputation worth carrying. The garrison ran on a loose rhythm. Morning inspection at sunrise, which the commandant, a heavy-set man named Dos Velarin, whose enthusiasm for military protocol had declined in direct proportion to his years at the pass, conducted in approximately 4 minutes. Border logging from mid-morning until 2 hours past noon, when the mountain lights started going flat and the traders knew to make camp before the pass froze over. Evening meal in the common hall. Sleep. Repeat. On the 3rd day after my arrival, a diplomatic escort came through from the south. I was on logging duty at the lower gate when they appeared around the bend of the road. 7 figures, 4 of them in the pale blue traveling robes of the Velsora court, 2 of them armored outriders who rode with the particular straight-backed posture of household cavalry that has been told to make a good impression. The 7th was on foot. She was walking 3 paces behind the last outrider, which put her in the position of a servant or a support staff member. She carried a satchel across one shoulder and a document case under her arm. She was tall, taller than any of the 4 robed court members by most of a head, with skin the color of old copper left in sea air, a warm brown, with just the faintest greenish undertone that I would later understand was how the Velsora showed the particular lineage of their highland houses. Her hair was black, shot through with threads of silver that were too deliberate to be age and too numerous to be accident, braided and coiled against the back of her head with a simplicity that struck me even then as a choice rather than a lack. Her eyes, when they passed briefly across me while I held the gate, were the pale, rain-washed color of the sky above the pass at dawn. Not quite gray, not quite blue, a color that had no single name I knew. I recorded the party in the log. 4 delegates from the Velsora Planetary Assembly, traveling to the high plateau for a trade agreement certification. 2 outriders, 1 interpreter. The court delegate who presented the travel documents, a narrow-faced man with an elaborate collar pin who gave his name as Factor Seth Vel Oran, looked at me the way that certain categories of official look at garrison soldiers, which is to say he looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's uncertain is in the right room. He answered my questions in a tone that suggested he was doing me a personal favor by speaking at all, and when I asked him to confirm the interpreter's name for the log, he paused. "That is a support staff member," he said. "Not a delegate. Your log requires delegate names only." I looked at my log. The Accord Border Documentation Protocol that had been handed to me by the previous watch officer, a document so worn it had started to separate along the fold lines, said clearly that all individuals crossing a monitored pass point must be named in the record, regardless of function. The protocol requires all individuals, I said. Name for the record, please. The factor's expression was the specific expression of a man who has not been corrected by someone he considers beneath him in quite some time. He looked at the woman walking behind the party. She is listed in the delegation support manifest as interpreter Sora. I wrote it down. I looked at the woman. She had not stopped walking or adjusted her posture during this exchange. She stood with the document case against her ribs and looked at a point somewhere past my left shoulder with the patient, calibrated blankness of someone who has learned to make themselves small in spaces where being visible is dangerous. Thank you, I said to her directly. Her eyes moved to mine, just for a moment. Something shifted in them. Not quite surprise, not quite recognition. More like a light turning on in an empty room and then someone remembering to keep the curtain drawn. She said nothing. The party moved through the gate. I watched them go up the road toward the Garrison proper, where they would be given the transit dormitory and a cold meal while their certification documents were processed, a procedure that took approximately 2 days. I made a note next to her name in the log, not anything meaningful, just a mark that meant I would remember this one. I did not know what she was yet. I am telling the story in order. The certification process for diplomatic trade parties required that an official Garrison representative be present at the evening briefing, which was the court delegates' opportunity to clarify any documentation irregularities before the mountain crossing. I drew that duty because I was the newest arrival and therefore the most available. Das Velaren, our compant, had a standing policy of assigning the newest soldiers to whatever task he found most tedious. I want to describe the common hall because it matters to what happened later. Thresh Crossing's common hall had been built for functionality and had been maintained in the manner of all Garrison common spaces everywhere, at the functional minimum that kept soldiers from complaining actively. Stone walls, 3 long tables with benches, a cook stove at the east end that was enormous and ancient and generated heat in the way that very old iron things do, not efficiently, but with the particular hospitality of an object that has been at its task for so long that the task has become indistinguishable from its nature. There was a shorter table at the east end near the stove, a corner table that got more heat than the long tables, and that had been, by tradition and habit and simple pragmatism, where the soldiers who had the night watch ate before going out into the cold. I mention this because the stove table is where this story happens, in all its significant moments. Garrison life is like that. The important things happen in the corners, near the heat, in the places that don't look like stages. The briefing was held in the Garrison's formal receiving room, which was formal only in the sense that someone had placed a table in it at some point, and the table had stayed. Factor Seth Veloran sat at one end with 2 of the robed court members. The other 2 robed members were elsewhere. I later learned one had a travel sickness, and the other had found the armorer's private stock of plateau wine. The interpreter, Sora, the log said, though the factor had said it, the way you say a servant's name in a house where the servants don't have surnames, sat at the far end of the table with her document case open and a stylus in her hand, positioned to take notes rather than contribute. I sat across from the factor and went through the documentation checklist. It took about 20 minutes. The factor answered in that tone of measured sufferance. The court members said almost nothing. The interpreter said nothing at all until Factor Veloran, in the middle of a discussion about the certification seal format, made an error. He cited the wrong provision of the Accord Trade Statute. It was a small error, but a meaningful one. The provision he named had been amended 3 years prior. And if the certification was filed under the old language, the Plateau Assembly had the legal standing to refuse the documents on arrival, which would void the entire trip. I opened my mouth to note this. Provision 7C, the interpreter said quietly. The amendment passed in the 3rd year of the current compact. The seal format requirement moved to 7D2. The factor may wish to confirm with his document set. The room went still. Factor Veloran turned to look at her with an expression that cycled through several things quickly. Surprise, irritation, the particular calculation of a man deciding whether to be grateful or offended. He settled on a version of both, which looked on his face like a pressed smile. "Thank you," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. He did not look at her for the rest of the meeting. When it ended and the factor and the court members had withdrawn, I remained to collect the Garrison copies of the documentation. The interpreter stayed as well, closing her case and organizing the papers with the efficient precision of someone who had done this exact task in 100 rooms, on 100 worlds, and never once been thanked it for it. "That was correct," I said. "The 7D2 citation." She looked up. The same light-adjusting quality to her gaze, measuring distance before committing to presence. "I know. He would have filed under the wrong provision." "I know that as well. He's not going to thank you." She set her case on the table and looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite its absence. It occupied the thin country between the two, a country where people live who have stopped expecting courtesy but haven't quite given up on it either. "I'm aware of what he's going to do." I offered her my hand. "Bren Halvar, Garrus Third Watch." She looked at my hand, then she shook it, once, with the economy of someone to whom the gesture is slightly foreign but not unwelcome. Her grip was precise. Her palm had the callous patterns of someone who had worked with their hands for a long time, though not at labor, at writing, at equipment, at the kind of careful manual work that leaves its mark differently than a field soldier's. "Sora," she said. Just the one name. I let it stand. I went back to the barracks. I lay on my bunk and thought about the light in her eyes when I'd said, "Thank you" at the gate, and what it meant that she'd looked like a woman being offered something she'd learned not to reach for. The transit dormitory at Thresh Crossing was a long, low building attached to the west wall of the Garrison proper, built for functionality and maintained at the lower limit of that standard. 12 bunks, 2 shared washrooms, 1 window on the north face that let in the mountain cold with enthusiasm. Diplomatic parties were entitled by Accord protocol to the dormitory and to 1 meal per day from the Garrison kitchen, which Rendet, our cook, a compact man from the northern lowlands who had opinions about dried legumes, prepared with the conviction that quantity was an adequate substitute for quality. On the second morning, I was assigned to escort duty for the transit party, walking the route from dormitory to the certification office and back, a job that existed mainly to prevent diplomatic incidents, and that was understood by everyone to be unnecessary. The factor didn't need an escort. He needed to be seen to have one. I collected the party from the dormitory at the 7th bell. The factor and his 3 colleagues came out in the correct order. The interpreter came out last, carrying the case, and fell in behind them. The certification office was a 10-minute walk through the Garrison yard. The mountain cold was hitting hard that morning, a wind off the upper pass that came in clean and sharp and found every gap in a coat that wasn't properly fastened. Factor Veloran and his colleagues were dressed for the cold. Court protocol apparently included adequate outerwear. The interpreter was in the same traveling robe she'd had on when they arrived, which was a light weave suited to the southern lowlands, not to mountain air at altitude. I watched her for 30 seconds. She was walking with her arms folded, the case pressed to her ribs, her breath coming in small visible clouds. Her jaw was set. She had the particular posture of someone who has decided that discomfort is not something they're going to mention. I want to be precise about what I was thinking in that moment, because I've been asked about it since, and my answer has always been the same. I wasn't thinking anything complex. The situation was simple. A person was cold. I had a coat. The arithmetic from there required no advanced calculation. There is a version of the world. I have encountered it in briefing rooms and diplomatic chambers and garrison yards and every professional context I have ever occupied, in which a person's function determines what they are entitled to be offered. An interpreter is entitled to interpreter category treatment. A queen, or a woman who was once a queen, or a woman who carries a registry entry that the people around her have decided not to read, is entitled to something different. I have never been able to operate according to that version of the world. I have tried when the operational situation seemed to require it, and I have found that it asks of me something I don't have to give: the ability to see a clear and simple human fact, a person is cold, and choose not to see it because of a category designation in a document. I took off my outer coat, the Garrison issue wool, heavy and worn but functional, and held it out to her. She stopped walking. The factor and his colleagues were ahead and not paying attention. It was just the two of us at that moment, with the mountain wind moving between us and the certification office at the far end of the yard. "You'll freeze before we get there," I said. She looked at the coat. She looked at me. She said, in the careful, measured tone of someone selecting every word, "That is not necessary. You're cold. I am managing. I know you are. You're still cold." A silence. The wind pushed at the edges of her robe. She took the coat. She folded it over her arm rather than putting it on, which I found telling, still maintaining some version of not needing it, a final formal objection to being cared for, but she didn't hand it back. We walked to the certification office. About halfway there, she put the coat on. She didn't say anything when she did it. She didn't look at me. I looked straight ahead and kept walking. When we returned to the dormitory 2 hours later, she handed the coat back without comment. I took it without making anything of it. The factor was already complaining to one of his colleagues about the processing time. The court members were debating something in their own language. The interpreter folded the satchel straps over the document case and set it on the dormitory step and looked at the mountains. I followed her gaze. The upper pass was catching the midday sun, the snow on the ridgeline giving off a flat, cold light that made the peaks look like they'd been cut from the sky with a knife. "They're not actually that hostile," I said. "The mountains, in the summer, they're quite manageable." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've crossed them 3 times. In the winter." I looked at her. She was still looking at the peaks. "For work." "Twice," she said. "Once for other reasons." I didn't ask. She didn't offer. We stood there for a minute more with the mountain light between us and the factor's voice, moving in and out of hearing from inside the dormitory. Then she said quietly, without looking away from the peaks, "The coat was kind. Thank you." "You're welcome," I said. She nodded once and picked up her case and went inside. I have thought about that nod more times than I can count. There was something in it that I couldn't name then, and can name now only by describing it the long way around. It was the nod of a person who has given up on a thing, then had it returned to them unexpectedly, and doesn't quite know yet whether to trust the return. On the afternoon of the second day, while the certification processing was in its final stage, I was in the records room, cross-checking the transit log against the Accord documentation protocols when I found it. I wasn't looking for it. I was updating the log entry for the diplomatic party, verifying the listed names against the official seals on their travel documents, making sure the certification office's copies matched the Garrison's copies the way a conscientious soldier does when he has been assigned a task and has decided to actually do it. The factor's name checked out. The 4 court members' names checked out. Their seals, their function designations, their home assembly codes, all present. I got to the interpreter's entry. The travel documents listed her as Interpreter Sora, Assembly Support Function, Velsora Delegation, no house designation, no planetary registration number, which was unusual. Accord protocol required a planetary citizen number for every named individual on a diplomatic party manifest. I went to the secondary file. The supplementary documentation that diplomatic parties are required to submit at border crossing points, which details the full civic identity of each member of the party. It was a 2-page form. Most of the entries were standard. Her entry was not standard. The form showed civilian identification number, that I cross-referenced against the Accord Registry database the Garrison had access to, a system designed primarily for checking warrants and identity disputes, but which also contained basic public record information on registered individuals across the member worlds. The system returned a flag, a red one. I sat with it for a moment. The records room was empty. The mountain light was going flat through the single narrow window. I could hear the cook in the kitchen 2 buildings over shouting at someone about the evening meal. The flag's color on the screen was a particular shade of red, the bureaucratic red that means conflict rather than danger, the color of a filing system that has found 2 things that cannot simultaneously be true. And I looked at it for longer than it deserved, the way you look at something when part of you already knows what it means and is being patient with the part of you that is still processing. The flag was an identity conflict, 2 records associated with the same identification number. One was the record I'd expected, an interpreter listed with the Vel Sora assembly, unremarkable, functional. The other was an archived record, a sealed record with a court designation stamp that I recognized from my years of garrison duty. The royal seal of the Vel Sora Highland House, which I knew from the treaty documentation was the ruling house of the High Plateau before the current compact had reorganized the plateau territories into the assembly system 14 years ago. The archived record listed a name, a full name, not a single word truncated to a function label. The name was Vel Sora Isen, which in the Highland Court designation system meant first of house, primary lineage, which meant, in the language I understood, the title the records called Her Serenity, the term used exclusively for the ruling queen of the Highland House, before the compact had changed what ruling meant on the plateau. I sat with this information for a long time. Then I got up very carefully and went back to the main records room and pulled the compact documentation from the filing cabinet where it had been sitting since my predecessor had stored it 7 years ago without ever needing it. I sat down and I read it. Not all of it. The compact was 400 pages of political language that had been negotiated over 18 months by people who were paid to use 4 words where one would do. But the relevant sections. I will tell you what I found, and I will tell you plainly, because the language of the compact itself was not plain, and that lack of plainness was the point. The compact had dissolved the Highland Royal House as a governing authority and transferred its powers to the new planetary assembly. The dissolution had been described, in the diplomatic language the document used, as voluntary. I read the surrounding context 3 times. It was not voluntary. The compact's own language made clear, if you read it carefully enough, that the dissolution had been achieved through a coordinated effort by the lowland city-states to restructure the plateau trade agreements in a way that made the Highland House economically non-viable, cutting off the trade routes that funded the Highland administrative structure, reclassifying the plateau's primary export commodities under a tariff schedule that made them non-competitive at any lowland market, and then to offer the compact as the only alternative to the collapse that they had engineered. The Highland House had negotiated for 18 months. There were amendments in the compact's margin language that showed where they had fought and won minor concessions. The preservation clause for the territorial registry was one of those concessions. The acknowledgement of Highland territorial sovereignty in matters of local custom was another. Small things, hard fought, in the margins of a document that gave away the center. The Queen, at the time, listed in the compact as Vel Sora Isen, the same name in the registry, had signed the compact under conditions the document described as bilateral agreement, and which looked, from where I was sitting in the records room of a border garrison on a cold mountain evening, like a negotiated capitulation in which the alternative to signing was watching her people starve by the deliberate design of parties who had decided they wanted the plateau and had found a way to take it that left no fingerprints on the taking. She had been 26 years old when she signed it. She was 40 now, by the arithmetic. She had been traveling with a diplomatic party from the assembly that had replaced her, carrying their documents, filing their protocols, walking 3 paces behind the last outrider. I closed the compact documentation and put it back in the filing cabinet very carefully. I went and sat on the bench outside the records room in the cold mountain air and looked at the dormitory building until the evening bell rang. I want to be precise about what I decided in that moment and what I didn't decide. I didn't decide to do anything dramatic. I didn't plan a revelation or a confrontation. I didn't have a strategy. What I had was the same thing I'd had when I told my commanding officer in front of 12 soldiers that the plan was going to get people killed. A clear, simple, stubborn sense that the thing happening was wrong and that I was capable of doing the small adjacent thing that was right, and that not doing it would require more effort than doing it, because I would have to actively work against myself. What I did was go to the dormitory building, knock on the door frame of the transit dormitory. The door itself was propped open against the mountain, cold, a Garrison quirk that everyone had stopped questioning, and asked if the interpreter was available. She was. She came to the door frame with her document case. She was in the lowland robe again, the cold already finding her. I had my coat on. The evening meal is in 40 minutes, I said. The common hall, there's a table at the east end that gets the stove heat. I paused. If you want. She looked at me. The measuring look, the curtain adjustment. The factors party dines separately. You're not required to dine with the factors party. The Accord protocol covers meals for all named transit individuals. You're named. The measuring look held. You checked. I checked the protocols. It's what I'm here for. A silence. The stove table, she said. East end. 40 minutes. She came. I was already at the table when she arrived. I had 2 mugs of the Garrison's pressed mountain tea, a tradition that the cook maintained with religious conviction regardless of the quality of his other offerings, and which was, in fact, very good, and the evening ration from the kitchen, which was a legume stew that was significantly better than it looked. She sat across from me. She set her case on the floor beside her chair. She wrapped both hands around the mug and said nothing for a moment, which was fine. I wasn't there to make her talk. I was there because the alternative, letting her eat alone in that dormitory, or with the fact party who treated her like a marginally necessary piece of administrative equipment, was something I was unwilling to do. That's the whole of it. No strategy. Just the clear, clean line between a thing that was wrong and a thing that was right. The stew is better than it looks, I said eventually. Most things are. She picked up the spoon, then, after a moment, and some things are exactly as bad as they look. I watched her face. The not-quite smile was there again. The factor's morning briefing, I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not a laugh, but the shape that comes before one when a person has remembered they're capable of it. He cited the wrong provision for the 3rd time this trip. I stopped counting at 5. He didn't know you'd catch it. He doesn't know I know. She looked at her stew. He hired an interpreter. He assumes that means a language function. Someone to manage the words so he doesn't have to. And instead, he got someone who also understands the law. He got what was available. She looked up. The assembly hires by availability. They don't ask much about background. She said it with a flatness that was not bitterness. Bitterness had a heat to it, and this was the cooled version. Something that had been bitter once and had finished burning. I thought about the compact documentation in the filing cabinet, about the phrase bilateral agreement. How many of these certification trips have you done? I asked. 11. In 4 years. And before that? She looked at me steadily, the rain-washed eyes. Other work. At home. She was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly as long as the moment where a person decides what version of themselves to offer. At home, she said, we ate. The stove made its comfortable sounds. Outside, the mountain wind was picking up toward evening, and somewhere in the Garrison yard, a gate fitting was complaining about it. Rendit came out of the kitchen once to refill the press pot without being asked at. He was a man of few words and considerable practical intelligence, and he understood, in the way that cooks understand the social geometry of their spaces, that the table at the east end required no interruption tonight. He set the pot down, looked at neither of us, and went back to the kitchen. I refilled the mugs from the press pot on the table. She didn't stop me. After a while she said, without looking up from the mug, "You were at the certification briefing yesterday." When I corrected the provision citation, "I was. You didn't flinch when he reacted. He was rude. I was watching." She looked up. Most people who were watching would have looked away. "I don't flinch well," I said. "It's gotten me in trouble." "How much trouble?" "Enough to end up at a border garrison in the mountains." The not quite smile again. "I know something about assignments that result from inconvenience." "I imagine you do." She looked at me for a long moment. I want to be accurate about what was in that look, because I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't quite suspicion. It wasn't quite hope. It was the look of a person standing at the edge of a thing they've been careful not to stand at the edge of, because the last time they stood there the ground gave way, testing the soil, deciding whether it holds. "You know," she said. It wasn't a question. I looked at the records. She put the mug down. "You weren't supposed to look at those. The Accord Registry is available to Garrison border officers for all named individuals crossing the pass. You're named." She was quiet. Outside, the gate fitting complained again. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "Nothing." She looked at me. "I'm not going to report it, file it, or flag it to the factor or anyone in his party," I said. "It's not my business to do any of those things. You're a legal traveler with valid documents and a function in a legitimate delegation. The information in the registry doesn't change any of that. It changes how people treat me," she said, "when they know. I imagine it does. Some people treat me as a threat when they know. Some treat me as a curiosity. Some treat me as a tragedy." She looked at her hands, which were still around the mug. "None of them treat me as a person." "I'll treat you as a person," I said. She looked up. "It's what I was going to do anyway," I said. "This doesn't change it. I just want to be accurate." The look on her face was one of the hardest things I've ever sat across a table from. It was the face of someone being handed something they had stopped believing existed. Not a large thing, not rescue or recognition or an overturning of everything, just the small, foundational thing that everyone is supposed to be able to count on, and that she had been living without for long enough that being offered it felt like a foreign object she didn't quite know where to put. She looked at the table, then at the mug, then at me. "Bren Halvar," she said. "Third watch." "That's right." "Why are you at a border garrison?" I told my commanding officer his plan was going to get people hurt. "Was it?" "It got 3 people hurt." She nodded slowly. "You were right. Usually doesn't help," I said. "No," she said, "it usually doesn't." We sat there for another hour. We talked about the mountain pass and the trading patterns through it and the way the plateau weather moved. We talked about the certification process and the specific legal language of the trade statute amendments and the 3 other provisions the factor had cited incorrectly over the course of the trip. She knew the statute better than I did, which I had expected, and she knew the treaty history behind it better than anyone who hadn't lived inside it could be expected to, which I had also, by then, expected. At one point I said, because it was true and I didn't see the point of not saying it, "You were a good queen." She was very still. "I read the compact," I said. "The circumstances of the dissolution, what was done. You held out for 18 months before you signed." She looked at the table. "I signed. You were 26 years old and they had dismantled the economic base of your kingdom. I still signed. You kept your people from starvation by signing," I said. "That's what the compact's own language says if you read it right." She was quiet for a very long time. I watched the stillness in her. The way a person sits when they've been carrying something for so long that the weight has become indistinguishable from their own body, and someone noticing it is almost more than they can hold. I haven't been called that in 4 years, she said. I didn't ask what. We both knew. You don't have to be an interpreter, I said. On this trip or any other, I'm aware of my options. The assembly's options for you, I said, not yours. She looked at me. You still know the law. You still know the statute, the treaty provisions, the compact language, better than any of the 4 delegates who've been traveling under your expertise for the past 3 weeks. I kept my voice level, not making a speech, just saying things that were true. The Highland House is dissolved in name. The territories still exist. The people who live in them still trade, still cross this pass, still need their agreements certified correctly. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, I said. I'm observing that you have options that you may have stopped considering because you've been standing in the wrong position in someone else's delegation for long enough that it started to feel like the only position available. She looked at me for a long time. The mountain wind was a serious complaint now, outside, the Garrison's old stone holding it back with the stoic indifference of stone that has been holding back wind since before anyone alive was born. You're a very direct person, she said, I've been told. It got you sent to a border garrison. It also got me here, I said. She looked at the mug, then at the stove, then at her hands. I haven't thought about options, she said finally, in a long time. I know. It's easier not to. I know that too. She sat with it. I let her sit with it. There is a version of this kind of conversation where the person trying to help keeps talking, keeps filling space, keeps offering things because silence feels like failure. I have never understood that version. Silence is where the real thinking happens. My job was to be the person still sitting at the table when she was done thinking. After a while, she said, the Factor's lead delegate has a meeting at the Plateau Assembly in 9 days to certify the renewed trade agreement. I know. It's in the documentation. Provision 7D2, she said slowly, requires that the certification be witnessed by a registered representative of the Highland territories, not the Assembly, the territories themselves. The compact preserved that requirement specifically. She looked at me. The Factor doesn't know that provision. Apparently not. He's going to walk into that assembly meeting with an incorrectly structured certification, and the Plateau Assembly is going to flag the missing witness designation, and the whole trip is going to have to be postponed for a minimum of 60 days while they locate a registered territorial representative. She paused. If they can locate one, the compact dissolved the House. It's not clear who the registered representatives are now. The compact preserved the territorial registry, I said. I looked that up too. The Highland House members who were living in the territories at the time of dissolution retained their registry status. They just don't exercise governance authority. She was quiet. Your name is still in that registry, I said, under the original designation. The Assembly's employment record is a separate file. The registry hasn't been updated. She looked at me. You could walk into that assembly meeting, I said, as the registered territorial representative, with full legal standing under Provision 7D2. And the certification would be correct. And the Factor would have to acknowledge my authority to be in that room, she said. And the assembly delegates would have to address you correctly, I said. By the title the registry still carries. She sat with this. I watched her work through it, not the logistics, which she understood immediately and better than I did, but the weight of it, the thing that had been folded away for 4 years, taken out and looked at and put away again because there was nowhere to put it down. Her serenity, she said very quietly, that's what the registry says. She looked at the stove. The light from it was warm and orange, and it fell across her face and made the silver threads in her hair catch. I would have to notify the Factor, she said. You'd have to notify the certification office. The Factor would be informed by the protocol. He's going to be furious, almost certainly. He's going to try to have the registry entry challenged. He'd have to go to the Accord Central Tribunal for that. 60 days minimum. which is longer than it would take for the certification to be filed correctly if he just lets you do your job. She looked at me. Your actual job, I said. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire in the stove settled and one of the logs shifted with a small sound, and the mountain wind outside decided to try a different angle on the Garrison wall. Why are you doing this? She said. Because the factor's going to file that certification wrong, and 60 days of trade disruption is going to hurt people who have nothing to do with the assembly's politics, I said. And because you know how to fix it, and because you've been walking 3 paces behind someone who doesn't deserve it. That's 3 reasons. Yes. She looked at me for a long time, rain-washed eyes in the stove light, the country between the smile and its absence. The first 2 reasons are practical, she said. Yes, the third one isn't. No, I said. It isn't. She picked up the mug, drank, set it down with the precise, deliberate economy of movement that I had noticed in her from the first morning, the kind of movement that belongs to people who have learned to take up exactly as much space as they choose to take up, and no more. I'll need to send a notification to the certification office tonight, she said, to request amendment to the party documentation before the mountain crossing. The certification office closes at the 8th bell. It's the 7th hour now. Then I should write it now. I'll walk you to the office, I said. She looked at me. You're off duty. I'm the one who mentioned the stove table, I said. I'll see it through. We walked to the certification office together in the cold mountain evening. She drafted the notification in the officer's writing room while I waited outside. It took her 11 minutes. She came out with the document, sealed correctly with her own, which she carried, I noticed, in a small case inside the document satchel, the kind of small case a person keeps something in that they haven't used in a long time, but can't quite bring themselves to leave behind. She handed the notification to the night duty officer. He recorded it in the transit log and stamped it and handed her a receipt. We walked back across the Garrison yard in the dark. The mountain had gone completely quiet in the way it only does at night in winter, a silence so total that the sound of our footsteps on the stone seemed like a conversation. At the dormitory door she stopped. She turned. She looked at me. I don't know what's going to happen at the assembly, she said. Neither do I. The factor may succeed in challenging it. He may. The assembly may not recognize the registry status. They may not. She looked at the stars above the pass. The mountain cold was very clean, the kind of cold that doesn't threaten you, but simply reminds you that it was here before you and will be here after. But the notification is filed, and the certification office knows your correct designation. She looked at me, her serenity. That's what the registry says. A silence, the mountain kind, the total kind. Why didn't you look away, she said, at the briefing, when the factor was rude. I told you, I don't flinch well. That's why you were watching. That's not why you didn't look away. I thought about it, the honest version. Because he was rude to someone who was correct, I said. And I wanted her to know that at least one person in the room saw it. The expression on her face was the one I have come back to more times than I can count. Not the almost smile, not the country between things. This was something further along, something that had traveled through the country between and come out the other side into actual territory. A small thing on the outside. Just the way her eyes changed, the way the set of her jaw softened by a fraction that would have been invisible if I hadn't been paying attention. A small thing that was not actually small. Good night, Brenhalvar, she said. Good night, your serenity. She was still for a moment, just a moment. Then she nodded, the nod again, but different this time. The first nod had been a person remembering not to reach for things. This one was a person who had decided to reach. She went inside. I stood in the Garrison yard for a while in the mountain cold, looking at the stars, and felt very certain that I had done the right thing, which is a feeling I have learned over 36 years, not to squander when it comes, because it is less common than you would hope. What happened at the Plateau Assembly is not mine to tell in full. I was not there. I know it from 3 sources. The official account that eventually made it into the Accord Regional Record, the private letter that arrived at the Garrison 6 weeks later, and the account of the Garrison supply officer, who had accompanied the delegation on the mountain crossing and was present in the assembly hall. What the official account says, the Velsora Lowland Assembly Trade Delegation presented their certification for the Highland Trade Agreement on the 4th day of the 9th month. At the certification review, a challenge was raised regarding the absence of a registered Highland Territorial representative as required by Provision 7D2 of the Trade Statute. The delegation's interpreter, previously listed under Assembly Function, presented valid Accord registry credentials, identifying her as Velsora Eason, registered representative of the Highland Territories, per the Compact Preservation Clause. The certification was correctly filed with this witness designation. The trade agreement was certified. There were no delays. What the official account does not say is what the supply officer told me when he came back. I will tell you what he said. He found me in the common hall on the evening of his return. He sat across from me at the long table and accepted the mug I offered him and was quiet, for a moment, in the way of a man who has seen something that has taken up residence in him and has not yet found the right language for it. Then he said, "She walked into that room like she had been waiting to walk into it for 14 years. Not dramatically, not like a performance, like someone who has been carrying a piece of furniture through a house looking for the room it belongs in, and has finally reached the right room." The factor had gone the color of old bone when she stood up and presented her registry credentials. He had sat very still in the way that men sit when they have been entirely outmaneuvered and are computing whether there is a move remaining on the board. There was not a move remaining on the board. The assembly delegates had gone quiet. The supply officer described the quiet as the particular quiet of a room that has been holding something at a collective arm's length and has just been required to set it down. Not hostile, not warm, exactly, the quiet of people recalculating. He said he could see it moving through the room like a current, one face to the next, the recognition spreading not from emotion but from simple mathematics. The credentials were valid, the provision was clear, the registry entry was confirmed, and the woman standing at the table knew the law better than anyone else in the chamber. The lead assembly delegate, a woman who had been at the compact negotiations 14 years ago and who had, the supply officer noted, sat very straight in her chair when Velsora Eason presented her credentials, stood up without being asked, which was not protocol. The protocol for certification witnesses was that they remained seated until the presiding delegate acknowledged them. She stood up and she said the formal address, the full address, the Highland form, the title the registry carried. Her serenity. The room followed because the lead delegate had done it, and because even people who have chosen convenience over principle can recognize, when the moment arrives in front of them with its paperwork in order and its registry entry confirmed and its provision citation correct and its 14 years of enforced patience finally translated into a single clear legal fact, that the moment is the moment. The factor had said nothing for the rest of the session. There was nothing to say. The supply officer finished his tea. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, she was very composed. Through all of it, she answered questions, she cited provisions, she corrected a minor error in the draft certification language that the presiding clerk had made. She did her work, the supply officer said, the real work, in her own function, in her own name. He paused, he said, and when it was done, when they were filing out of the chamber, she stopped at the door and she looked back at the room once, not triumphantly. The supply officer was clear on this, not as if she was savoring it or claiming it. The way a person looks at something they've been putting back together for a long time and sees, for the first time, the shape of what it's going to be. Then she walked out. I thanked the supply officer and refilled his mug and did not ask the question I was sitting with, because it was not a question for him to answer. The private letter arrived 43 days after the delegations departed the garrison. It was addressed to Bren Halvar, 3rd Watch, Garrison Thresh Crossing. It was written in a hand that was precise and deliberate, the kind of hand that has spent years doing careful work. It said, the certification was accepted, the provision held. I have been informed that the Highland Territorial Registry is being formally reinstated as a recognized entity under the Compact's Preservation Clause, which will require the Assembly to acknowledge the Registry's existing entries. There is a great deal of work ahead. I am writing to say that the stove table was warm and the tea was very good. I have accepted a position with the Accord Regional Compact Office in the capacity of Highland Territorial Liaison. I will be traveling less as an interpreter and more in my own function. Thank you for walking across the yard in the cold. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in my kit bag, in the small interior pocket that has a button closure and that I use for things I intend to keep. I went to the common hall. I got a mug of the pressed mountain tea which Rendette had made that morning with his usual conviction. I sat at the east table, the one that gets the stove heat, and I drank it. The mountain was doing its winter thing outside, the wind talking to the garrison walls. The stove had its usual opinions about damp wood. The garrison was the garrison, 43 soldiers, 1 cook, 1 armorer, 1 supply ledger. What had happened at the Plateau Assembly was already moving through the Accord channels, those slow formal rivers that carry the things that matter in the language that matters and eventually deposit them somewhere permanent. The Highland Territorial Registry reinstated. The Compact's Preservation Clause exercised for the first time in 14 years. A woman who had been walking 3 paces behind people who didn't deserve it, walking now in her own function, in her own name. I hadn't done much. I had given her a coat in a cold yard. I had made sure she was named in the log. I had sat across a table and refilled the mug and not looked away. I had walked to the certification office in the evening and said good night correctly. Most of what happened she had done herself. I want that understood. This is not a story about rescue. She didn't need rescuing. She needed, and this is the thing I have been trying to describe precisely, she needed one person in one cold garrison yard at one moment to stand next to her rather than 3 paces behind her and to say, in whatever small ways were available, I see what's happening here. And it's wrong, and you were right. That's what I had. That's what I gave. She took it and she did the rest. The letter came with a second page that I didn't describe yet because I wanted to describe it separately, in its own space. The second page said, the Assembly lead delegate in the course of the certification proceedings asked how I came to have my documentation in order. I told her a garrison soldier had found a cold woman walking without a coat and had looked her up in the registry to make sure she was treated. The delegate said she would make a note of the garrison's thoroughness. I thought you would want to know. The Highland Territories have a tradition. When someone does a thing that ought to be acknowledged but that the formal record will not capture, we use a phrase. There is no direct translation into the lowland language. The closest I can offer is, the one who held the door while the wind was blowing. You held the door. That is all. I will be in contact through the compact office when the liaison work brings me near the pass. I read the second page twice as well. Then I put it with the first page in the button pocket. Outside, the morning was arriving over the upper peaks, the first light coming flat and clean off the snow. The kind of light that doesn't ask anything of you but makes clear that the day is going to be whatever you make it. I finished the tea. I thought about the rain-washed eyes in the stove light and the precise deliberate hand in the letter and the word, not a rescue, not a grand gesture, just the held door, the name in the log, the refilled mug. I thought, yes, that's the thing. That is exactly the thing. I got up and went to morning inspection, which Das Velaren conducted in 4 minutes and 14 seconds, a personal record. The pass was clear. A trading party would be coming through at mid-morning. The ledger needed updating. There is a thing that happens to you after 36 years of doing a job in the way I have done mine. saying what is true when it is inconvenient, doing the small right thing when the small wrong thing would cost less. Where you become very certain about the difference between a meaningful moment and a dramatic one. The meaningful ones rarely look like the dramatic ones. They look like a gate log. They look like a coat offered in a cold yard. They look like a name written in a ledger, the way the protocol requires, while the person who submitted it with only one name looks at the ground and waits to be dismissed. The dramatic ones are what happens after, at the assembly, in the formal chamber, when the lead delegate stands up and says the title and the room follows. That part is real, and it matters, and I am glad it happened. But it happened because someone had already done the undramatic work. The provision research, the registry cross-reference, the walk to the certification office in the evening cold, the mug refilled without ceremony. I have never wanted to be the kind of person who needs the drama to motivate them. The motivation I understand is simpler. A person is cold. A person is named incorrectly in a log. A person has been walking 3 paces behind a man who doesn't know the law as well as she does, and the only thing that keeps that arrangement in place is that no one in the room has said the obvious thing plainly. The obvious thing plainly. She was right. He was rude. The registry said what it said. The provision was clear. That is all. That is the whole of what I did. She took those simple pieces and built something lasting from them, on the plateau, in the formal chamber, in the long work that the liaison position would become. I did my job. The mountains held the pass. The garrison held the mountains. And somewhere on the high plateau, in the compact office that had done the long, careful work of reinstating what should never have been taken, a woman was walking in her own name. That was enough. That has always been enough.